This is Garis book readings of my two published paper books, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. This is chapter 8 of my book, Multis and Monos, what the multicultured can teach the monocultured towards the creation of a global state. Chapter 8 is entitled Routes to Globa. I'm now reading the subtopics, headings. A. Introduction. B. Expand the European Union, EU, route. C. Merge the economic blocs, route. D. Merge the continental unions, route. E. Accretion model, route. F. Update the United Nations, UN, route. G. Dominant bully, route. H. Grassroots pressure, route. I. Globist national political parties, route. J. Hybrid approaches, route. K. Globist ideology. L. Timetable to Globa. A. This chapter deals with my views on what approaches I think the planet will use to create a global state. That is, which routes it will take to achieve this. There are many such routes. I list nearly a dozen here, discussing each in turn, and in roughly the order in which I think are the most probable to the least probable. I expect that all of them will play a role in the creation of a global state, and that they will reinforce each other to the point that the whole notion of building a global state will be in the air, with billions of people feeling that the time is ripe. These routes to the creation of a global state are mentioned briefly in the next dozen paragraphs or so, followed by more detailed discussion in which each route has its own section. Before beginning the overview of these routes, I should mention that future history will very probably prove me wrong. It's always hazardous to predict the future, but I would not be surprised that in terms of the broad outline of what I suggest will actually take place, I will not be too far off the mark. It seems to me that there's a certain inevitability about the creation of a global state. There are just too many pressures pushing in that direction, so that they appear to be unstoppable. Once I've described each route in turn, I attempt at the end of this chapter to provide some ideas on how a globist ideology could be promoted, and then give a timeline for the implementation of these routes, that is, an estimation as to when a global state might come into being. I probably won't live long enough to see it, that is, it will probably not occur before my death, which will probably occur in the decades of the 2030s or 2040s. However, I do expect to see the strong rise of the ideology in favour of globism, and to see globist political parties formed by then. I hope this book will make a contribution towards the generation of globist ideological debate and towards the creation of globist political parties. B. Expand the European Union, EU, route. In my own view, I consider the most probable route towards the creation of a global state will be via the expansion of the European Union, EU. This process is already well underway at the time of writing, that is, with 27 countries already members of the EU, with a handful of other hopefuls lining up to join. Ad-libbing, predicting the future is difficult, as I said. Brexit, the phenomenon of Brexit, so the British have exited the European Union, and several others may do the same in the near future. So what's likely to happen now is, from the time of recording this in 2017, is that Northern Europe will solidify and form a new kind of European Union and throw out the Southern European economies, which are less disciplined, less intelligent, and they will go off on their own. Personally, I would like to see the globists do a thorough propagandist job on the EU, trying to persuade it to start seeing itself as the spearhead or stepping stone towards the creation of a global state. If the EU does in fact play the role of the instigator of the global state, it will cover itself with glory as having pioneered something of huge historical and political importance, ridding the world of wars, spreading material wealth to the planet, and making billions of people much happier. It's a magnificent goal, and one worthy of the Europeans to aim for. They are already the front runners, with a considerable lead, so I think they should raise their sights, change their goals, change their ideologies, and propagate their dream of creating a unified world by creating a global state. There are only about 200 plus countries in the world, and already 27 of them have joined the EU. That's already roughly a seventh. I suggest that when the Eurocrats, that is the administrative branch of the EU, discuss future expansion, that they begin to see themselves as the nucleus of a future global state, so that they can smooth the path towards that goal, that is, by thinking in terms of a continuous expansion without limits until the whole planet is absorbed. Of course, labels will need to change. The first term that will need to be changed will be the E in EU. As the EU expands beyond what is usually referred to as Europe, the label European will need to be replaced by something broader, and as more countries or blocs keep joining it, that label will need to keep changing. For example, the EU already has trading and associate member status with many of the North African, that is Arabic nations. As these nations become true democracies, although unfortunately at the time of writing none of them are, they may be allowed to join the EU. I think I've said this before, I think Tunisia is a fairly solid democracy, so there's at least one. Once enough of them have joined, that is, once they have upgraded their cultures enough to pass the sufficiently civilized entrance tests, then the EU could change its name to the MU, that is the Mediterranean Union. Turkey has been trying for years to become a member of the EU and has constantly been knocked back on the grounds that it is not sufficiently civilized, that is not democratic enough, and does not permit a sufficient level of freedom of speech. For example, Turkish journalists and writers can be arrested at the time of writing for publishing criticisms of Turkey. This kind of thing is sneered at by EU countries, resulting in Turkey's constant rejection. This repeated rejection has made joining the EU a matter of national ego now. The Turks see joining the EU as a litmus test of the general status level of their country. It wounds them deeply each time the EU says no, and then tells them why. Turkey has now made major efforts to reform and modernize its society to make it acceptable in the eyes of the EU members, so it's probable that fairly soon Turkey will become a member. Speaking now, 10 years later from when this was written, Turkey's still not a member, for similar reasons. Once that happens, the EU will have taken a step into a new territory, literally. If Turkey is allowed to join, then why not other Muslim countries with similar levels of economic and democratic development? If Turkey joins and a globalist ideology makes strong inroads into the mindset of the EU members, then the future openness of the EU may make joining it the same kind of national ego testing as is the case for Turkey. Any non-EU member country which attempts to join the EU knows that it will have to pass the sufficiently civilized test. The EU has a long list of prerequisites, economic, social, political, etc., that any candidate member state has to pass. Ironically, if the US wished to join the EU, it would fail that test due to the single fact that the US still has the death penalty. The US is one of the few countries remaining in the world that still murders its murderers, along with only a handful of other countries that are notoriously non-democratic, such as Iran, North Korea, and China. Americas are only protected from feeling a strong sense of shame on this point because of their extreme insularity. They truly live in a state of ignorance is bliss. But when the Americans finally get the world media, they will feel the global moral pressure against them. The US is also the only advanced industrialized nation in the world that, at the time of writing, does not have a national health service, and that some 45 million Americans have no health insurance. Under such circumstances, there's no way that the US would pass the EU's sufficiently civilized test. So the very existence of the EU continues to act as a civilizing influence in its part of the world. As more former Soviet Union, USSR, member countries join the EU, especially the Ukraine and Belarus, after considerable progress towards democratization has been implemented, that unfortunately is still needed, then perhaps Russia will be tempted to join. If Russia joins, then the EU will definitely have to change its name. But to what? Perhaps the Eurasian Union, EU, which has the advantage of not changing the initial E, or to the EAU. That way other Asian countries could join, such as South Korea, Japan, Singapore, India, etc. If the North African Arab nations join the EU, or MU, and Russia does too, then we'll need a much broader term that encapsulates Europe, Russia and North Africa. I suggest calling it the Northern Union, since that would be the one characteristic they would have in common. The EU is pioneering a post-nationalist mentality that's appropriate for the creation of a global state. This fact is one of the major reasons why I see Europe as the main hope for Globa's creation. As each new EU member is admitted, that country will then be exposed and influenced by the mentality of the earlier EU members, who over decades have learned to throw off a lot of their former nationalist mentality in order to be effective members of the EU. As a new member comes in, it's absorbed by the existing mother hen and guided into a post-nationalist mentality as well. Very large nations like the US and China are still very nationalistic and would not be good candidates to join the EU. In America's case, it's too insular-minded, too arrogant and chauvinistic to be ready to join. Nevertheless, the Chancellor of Germany has recently, that was Merkel, who's still around amazingly, has recently tentatively proposed the creation of a TAFTA, Transatlantic Free Trade Area. That is, a free trade area of the EU and the US to act as a counterforce to the rise of China in the coming decades. China is still a dictatorship, so would not even be considered as a potential candidate. China's hypothetical candidature would be thrown out of court. Therefore, it's likely that smaller, less nationalistic countries would join the EU, partly to bolster their self-image as belonging to a powerful body, in the same kind of way that people of Rhode Island, a very small state in the US, feel proud to be Americans, rather than Rhode Islanders, due to the size and power of the US. Once the EU, or whatever its future name becomes, is seen by the world as a stepping stone towards the creation of a global state, then many other nations will probably be inclined to join it for reasons of national pride. At the present time, the EU consists of most of the richest, most democratic nations of the world, with its glorious history of Europeanizing the planet, with its industry, science, technology, democracy, etc. The whole planet is following Europe, or at least its major colony, the US. Once many nations have joined the EU, MU, NU, or whatever it will be called, then those nations which are not members will begin to feel a certain stigma as being insufficiently civilized, insufficiently developed to be considered worthy of being members. This will hurt national pride and hence motivate reforms within these countries to meet the entry standards of the EU. As they do meet those standards and as they join the EU, the prospect of the creation of a global state becomes all the brighter. C. Merge the economic blocs route. The EU is not the only economic/political union on the planet, although it's obviously the most famous one and has inspired the creation of many similar blocs around the world. For example, see the list of about 50 blocs in Chapter 5, Section E. The African Union, AU, models itself on the EU, hoping that by combining forces, African countries can have a bigger impact on the world. The EU itself argues the same way in regard to its relations with the US. We live at the time of writing in a world consisting of a growing number of economic blocs, that is about 50. The EU started out as such a bloc, the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, as a means to so integrate the basic economies of France and Germany in the 1950s that it would be impossible for them to go to war yet again. As an example of such a bloc, we have NAFTA, North American Free Trade Area, between the three countries of North America, Canada, the US and Mexico. In South America, Mercosur, M-E-R-C-O-S-U-R, Mercosur has created a common market, free trade area, amongst half a dozen countries. The US is aiming towards the creation of a free trade area of the Americas, FTAA. That would include North America, Central America and South America, with a total population of about 800 million people. Japan is proposing an Asian Union, consisting of Japan, China, India and Southeast Asian nations. If this Asian Union could be formed, it would be the biggest of its kind in the world. It would be more an economic bloc rather than a political bloc, because until recently that part of the world was one of the least democratic on the planet. Dictatorships are notoriously fond of their sovereignty, so it's unlikely we will see an Asian political union until China becomes a democracy. However, once that happens, then such an initiative would probably be led by China rather than Japan, which is only 1/10 the size of China in population terms. Southeast Asian nations have formed ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which started as an economic bloc and now is aiming at more political unification, modelling itself on the EU. If an Asian Union can be formed amongst the big players, Japan, China and India, then very probably ASEAN would merge with it. Such a bloc would consist of half the Earth's population. This creation of economic/political blocs is well underway and is one of the main political themes of our historical era. See Chapter 5, Section E. What could the next steps be? I think it's obvious what the answer is, namely a merging of the economic blocs into bigger blocs. For example, the US has free trade agreements with a number of countries that are not geographically close to it, for example with Australia, South Korea, etc. In South America, two trade blocs, Mercosur and the Andean Community, plan to merge in 2007 to form UNASUR, Union of South American Nations. It will have its own currency and parliament and is based on the EU, so the process of super bloc formation is starting. This kind of process will very probably continue. The EU will probably continue to expand and make trade deals with more countries, thus laying down the foundations for possible EU membership in the future. However, in order to make a qualitative change, a new ball game in terms of the size of free trade blocs, some of the big blocs would need to merge. There's growing talk of an Atlantic Union, that is, creating a free trade area between NAFTA and the EU. Culturally, these two regions of the world are very similar. They are both rich areas and are well-developed democracies. Initially, the agreement between the east and west sides of the Atlantic Ocean would be economic, that is, a free trade area. It's unlikely that the Americans, so accustomed to being top dog in the 20th century, will accept eating humble pie to become a component in a bigger political unit. The US will need to be humbled before it will be willing to surrender a lot of its sovereignty. At the present time, the US is the world's only superpower, with a defense budget double the size of Europe's, which means it can afford to be arrogant, because no one can challenge it. But in the longer term, this arrogance will only boomerang back against the US. It will make America slower to see the writing on the wall regarding the need to join larger economic/political blocs in the 21st century if it wishes to remain a player, that is, a leading influence. If the US remains on its own or only in NAFTA, it will become a bit player, that is, rather insignificant, in a world where the norm has become larger. The US will have to learn to look outward instead of inward, as it does at the present time. The US is extremely insular-minded and rarely bothers asking, quote, what do other countries do in a given situation, end quote. The unconscious insularity of the Americans is truly shocking to Maltese who have lived in the US for a while. I can confirm this after having lived there for 5 years. If an Atlantic Union could be formed, or at least an Atlantic Free Trade Area, AFTA, then by the time that would take to be established, the American government and think tanks would hopefully have become conscious that their future depends on joining the billion club, that is, joining an economic/political bloc with a population of roughly 1 billion people. China and India have over 1 billion people each in their populations. They can afford to remain outside economic/political blocs and still throw their weight around. If their economic growth rates continue to be more than double that of the US, then the 21st century will certainly see both countries eventually dwarf the US in terms of the size of their economies. However, if the US is able to form an FTAA and then move towards an EU-style continental political union with its 800 million people in the FTAA, it can remain a player in much the same way as Little France, Petite France, with its 60 million people, remains a player by providing leadership to the EU. If the EU and the FTAA merge, then depending on how many new countries have joined the EU, especially if Russia joins, then the Atlantic Union would be the biggest bloc, bigger than China. If an Asian Union is formed, even if it does not contain China initially, it would be the biggest in the world. So, step by step, this merging of economic blocs would create ever larger blocs until the whole planet was absorbed. Once a bloc was formed that consisted of more than half the Earth's population, then a gravitational model may take over. Small remaining countries would be almost forced to join, or be cast out in the cold, economically speaking. If the dominant bloc was also the most prestigious bloc, then it would be easier for the stragglers to want to join it. D. Merge the continental unions route. This route is closely related to the one above, but involves political and economic union. This is a more difficult process to achieve compared to creating a free trade area, because it's easier to get business people to integrate than it is to get politicians to give up national sovereignty. The EU, for example, still has its nationalisms. It's not a full political union at all. It does have a parliament, but at the time of writing does not yet have a president, let alone an elected president. I think that's changed now. I've been neglecting this topic for quite a few years. I need to get up to date. I think there is a European president and elected. The prime ministers and presidents of the EU member state nations still have the last word, but gradually things are changing. Increasingly, EU legislation is superseding national legislation, so that by incremental steps the EU is moving ever closer to becoming a political union. But there's still a long way to go before a true USE, United States of Europe, is formed. That is, a true political union, a single European state. ASEAN has now committed itself to becoming another EU. NAFTA is way behind that way and is largely content with forming a free trade bloc. For many years, Mercosur was in the middle somewhere between the EU and NAFTA in terms of its commitment to the idea of forming a political union. But as was mentioned briefly above, at the time of writing, Mercosur is planning to merge with the Andean community to form a political union, that is, UNASUR, Union of South American Nations, which will be similar in conception to the EU and having a parliament. Of course, if ever there's to be a global state, then by definition all nation states as they exist today will have to disappear, so that sovereignty exists totally with the global state. Hence the merging of economic blocs is not sufficient to create a global state. It's, however, very probably a necessary condition. Tight economic integration forces intercultural interaction, leading to mutual social and legislative influences, which makes the creation of political unions easier as cultural differences fade. Again, I see the Europeans as the leaders in this critical step. We still live in a world dominated by the nation state, both in reality and ideologically. The term national sovereignty is almost sacrosanct in today's world, but for the globalists it is anathema, backward, with strong negative connotations. The Europeans are experimenting with methods of diluting national sovereignties towards a higher goal of creating an EU, that is a political union, with a European president, a European constitution or treaty, etc. Steps along these lines have already been attempted and will continue despite early setbacks, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Ad-libbing, for example, Brexit, definitely a step backwards from a globalist point of view. Once the EU has succeeded more or less in forming a political union, it will serve as the model to the planet of what can be done, and due to its prestige, others will be motivated to mimic it. Other economic blocs are already doing the same, using the EU as their role model of an economic bloc. In fact, the EU is the biggest and most powerful trading bloc in the world at the present time, but will inevitably be eclipsed by both China's and India's burgeoning economies. Forming political unions will not be easy. All the difficulties discussed in Chapter 7 will act against this happening. Even the EU, which is pioneering this process, is making slow progress. We will have to wait until these powerful technological forces, as described in Chapter 5, come into being to accelerate the creation of political unions between nation states. Admittedly, political unification will be made easier between those countries that are already closely linked into economic blocs, but I suspect political unification will take a lot longer than economic unification. E. Accretion model route. The accretion model route is similar to those above. Its name is derived from the astrophysical model of planet formation, which occurs in the following way. A star, a sun, forms from a dust cloud that contains heavier elements cooked up in previous generations of stars. The dust cloud collapses in on itself and rotates, forming a disk of dust. The heavier elements are flung out into the circling disk, while the lighter elements remain mostly in the centrally placed star. The dust grains in the circling planetary plane attract each other to form clumps of dust, which in turn attract bigger grains more strongly, etc. This process continues at an exponential rate until the size of the clumps are huge, that is, the size of planets, that attract nearly all the smaller clumps in their orbits, clearing out the debris. Analogously, as the sizes of the economic/political unions increase, the stronger the gravitational, that is, economic/political attraction will become on those nation-states or smaller blocs that have not yet joined. Once the largest union becomes very large, then all the straggling nations and blocs will be pulled into it and will join it. F. Update the United Nations, UN route. Another route towards the creation of a global state that is favoured by some thinkers is updating the United Nations, EU. The EU already acts as the world's conscience, in the sense that if a nation wishes to punish another nation, it's no longer considered acceptable by global public opinion for that nation to punish the other nation unilaterally. The only country now that is powerful enough to snub global public opinion, as expressed in the General Forum of the UN, is the US. And even it has had its fingers badly burned recently with its unilateral invasion of Iraq. It's likely that the UN will play this role as the world's conscience more and more. In order to do this more effectively, the UN needs to be modernized to reflect better the political realities and power relationships in the world. The Security Council, as set up after World War II, contained the most powerful countries of the time. Now, other powerful countries want to join it. Personally, I've chosen to place the update the UN route to the creation of the global state rather lower in the probability hierarchy than other globist theorists. The UN is really a club of nation-states and will probably remain that way until the nation-states themselves unify economically/politically. I just don't see the UN having much of a role in this unification process. I think it will follow the globalization trend rather than create it. I may be wrong on this. My judgment is that it will be the more socially progressive organizations, such as the EU, and particularly the impact of future technologies, that will force the creation of larger economic/political unions. The UN is very conservative and inefficient, to the point where the US lost patience with it and stopped giving it the US's share of the UN's funding. Of course, once it becomes clear that a global state is close to being formed, the role of the UN could be absorbed into this new state. But again, I don't see the UN being the dog that wags the tail of the growing global state. I see the UN being the tail that the emerging global state, that is the dog, will wag. But I may be wrong. Many globist thinkers consider the expand the EU route and the update the UN route as the two most probable routes to the formation of Globa. They may be right. G. Dominant bully route. Imagine that China goes democratic in the next decade, and that Russia becomes a lot more democratic than it currently is. Then we would be living in a world whose major players are all democratic, that is, the US, Europe, India, China, Russia. If these five bigs decide to get together and to agree to ban the arms trade or to form an economic bloc, then it would be so large it could virtually force the smaller players to join it. It could act as a type of dominant bully. Perhaps bullying is the wrong word. Perhaps benevolent force or big sister might be more appropriate. If such a grouping could be formed with its homogeneity of ideology, that is, its democratic base, it could have a powerful effect upon the world. It could become an almost planetary economic bloc, which would not only contain well over half of the world's population, but most of its global product, that is, the world's wealth. For purposes of discussion, let us label such